Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to EdTech Live. This interview with Stephen Downes was recorded on Tuesday, November 21st, 2006. Tonight's interview is sponsored by EduBloggerCon, the unconference for educational bloggers, June 22nd or 23rd in Atlanta, Georgia. For more information, please visit edubloggercon.com.
Well, my name, of course, is Stephen Downes. I work for the National Research Council, which is the Canadian National Research Agency. I'm based in a city called Moncton in New Brunswick, which is on the east coast of Canada. I'm a specialist in online learning, that is to say, using the internet to promote learning and education. I've been doing this job for about 5 years. Before that, I worked for the University of Alberta as an information architect, and before that, for Assiniboine Community College in Manitoba as a distance education and new instructional media design specialist. I've become a bit known, I guess, recently because I have a daily newsletter that I publish called OL Daily. It stands for Online Learning Daily. That has a fairly wide readership, and I cover news and events of interest. I try to focus on what's new and what's current, not so much the old press release kind of thing, or cover all the news stories, but I look at what people are talking about, what they're developing. I scour blogs and mailing lists and articles and the works, and put it out for people every day, or if they want every week, depends on what they sign up for. I've also done work in learning objects, learning management systems. I built an LMS while I was at Assiniboine, and especially RSS and content syndication. And so recently I've been working in a field that I call learning networks, and that's the idea of a distributed syndication network for the distribution of learning resources and other materials. And to that end, I've also been working with some of the people in Britain and elsewhere on the idea of the personal learning environment, which I believe, and I think other people believe, will replace the current learning management systems and content management systems that support education today. So that's the quick 5-minute summary.
Can you explain what you mean by what you just said, that the personal learning environment would replace what we're using today? And I did interview Martin Dugiamas from Moodle. And so how does Moodle fit into that model you've just described?
Yeah, well, Moodle's a learning management system, and consequently what it is, it's a content management system, essentially, that has a layer of educational functionality and services added to it. And in particular, Moodle is designed to support a particular approach to learning, a constructivist approach to learning. The idea being that students construct meaning for themselves through the process of their learning and their education. It's an LMS, a learning management system, a traditional learning management system, in the sense that a Moodle installation, just like a Blackboard installation or any other installation, is going to be typically run, organized, and controlled by the educational institution. It's a tool used by the educational institution to provide learning for its students. And I'm being precise in my emphasis of words here. It's associated with the model where a student applies for and is accepted to a particular institution and receives their entire education from that institution, where all of their educational services are provided from that single institution, and therefore that institution is responsible for that environment, just the way they would be responsible for the buildings and the grounds and the parking lots on a university campus. A personal learning environment, by contrast, is owned and operated and controlled by the student and not by the institution. And so a personal learning environment is not a place to store and manage content the way a learning management system is. It is rather a way for a student to access content or retrieve content from many different locations, to bring it back into this personal environment, to rework it, to repurpose it, to mash it up, do whatever they want with it, and then to publish it again to any of a number of distributed services. So the idea here is that the ownership of the educational process shifts from being that of the universities to that of the students. And the student, instead of attending one educational institution, obtains learning and learning materials and learning resources from any number of institutions. So that, in quick outline, is how that works. And then, of course, the work in content syndication and RSS and all the Web 2.0 stuff that people have been talking about form the backdrop for something like this, the backdrop for a PLE, the technology that makes it work. And of course, I do work in that technology.
So one of the sort of overriding questions that I keep thinking of as these technologies begin to be adopted by teachers and actively used is, do they really have the power to change education and the way that education is currently done? So what I hear you saying in your description of the personal learning environment is that you do believe that that's actually going to change the way people learn.
Well, it already has. I mean, the internet has already changed the way people learn. The internet was built by people who taught themselves, first of all, how to build an internet, and then did it. What the personal learning environment is a recognition of this and the development of a tool that allows educational institutions and other providers to actually take part in this new form of education. You know, people like Jay Cross talk about 80% of learning being informal. You know, the number's probably picked out of the air. Nonetheless, you know, when you reflect on the things that you've learned in your own life, most of what you learned outside the school. You learned how to tie your shoes outside school. You learned how to communicate with people outside schools, how to read a map outside schools, you know, all kinds of things. And especially when you think about what you do at work and how you get information and knowledge and skills on the job, this typically happens in an informal manner, and it typically happens in an environment that is underserviced with the resources that you need. You call somebody, they don't know. You call somebody else, they don't know. You dig around, you know. So with new technologies, especially with internet technologies, our form of learning has already changed. And so, you know, and when I'm asked, well, how will this technology change learning in schools or in educational institutes? You know, when will this change finally sweep through the education system? My response is typically, well, it won't. It'll take place outside the system.
That's so interesting. I'm hearing a lot of echoes of some thoughts that Doc Searles discussed, where he talked about sort of the history of open source being the history of people who were self-learners, and sure. How as that's moved into these technologies and it's moved into education, that again, you're seeing the same thread of self-learning being the most important part. And so I would imagine that there's going to be some political pushback, and I'm intrigued just by the whole idea of you know, where that ends up going.
Well, I mean, there's certainly political pushback, and there's political pushback, I think, from two major directions. One major direction is from the large industry that has been built up around the educational system, the content providing industry, publishers, journal publishers, educational video publishers, and all of that, who very much would like to see the current system remain in place because, you know, that's how they make their living. So, yeah, I'm kind of sympathetic to that, and I understand that, but you know, I'm still not supportive of it. And the other side, from people who've always thought of the educational system as the way to pass on their way of life, if you will, to pass on their political values or their religion or their beliefs or their prejudices or whatever. In other words, people who see the educational system as a means to as something to control, and the way of delivering education as a way of controlling, or at least attempting to shape the new generation that's coming forward. And this I have less sympathy for. I have very little sympathy for the idea of using education as a propaganda device. And so, I see developments like personal learning in the personal learning environment as reshaping much more than just education. I think that they empower people in a way that previous approaches to education, and indeed even previous educational theory, did not.
It does feel as though we're in the middle of something so transformative, both educationally and culturally, that it's hard to even grasp what the implications will be for all of these technologies, which are so significantly changing not only what we do, but how we think about what we do.
Well, if you think about it, with these new technologies, not just the communication, but also the creative capacity, things like video editing and sound editing, things like you're doing right here, the average individual has today the expressive power that used to be reserved only for medium to large size corporations in the past, or governments. This has to be transformative. You cannot put that much power into the hands of average people and expect the social and political system to remain the same, particularly when that social and political system assumes the disempowerment of those very individuals.
I'm intrigued by the fact that not only is it an expressive power, but it's the ability to think out loud and to then have those thoughts be supported, challenged, modified, and to grow, and how quickly and rapidly ideas can form and be tested and be expanded through the collaboration with others.
Sure. A lot of my thoughts along these lines occur as a result of the work that I've done online. I've been online for many years. I've been online since before there was a web, and I did my work in MUDs and online virtual environments and things like that. And I've always had the philosophy where I share what I create, and I share it while it's in the process of creation, which means some of the ideas aren't as well expressed as they might be, and some of them are frankly half-baked. But I've always done that, and I've always been criticized and commented on just in the way you describe, but also, people start sending me resources, and they start sending me ideas, and they start connecting me up with other people, and just little things. Like yesterday, Danielle Lemire tells me how to fix the PHP bug that's on my website, stuff like that. And, I see just and feel in myself this growing capacity with each day as these things come into me from other people. Even if I don't ask for them, they still come because this conversation, this communication has started. And once I start putting my stuff out there and being open and sharing, that's when the stuff starts flowing back to me. And that's the internet makes it possible, but also the attitude makes it possible.
So that's intriguing. My brother wrote a book on innovation that's fairly well known, and he talked about the myth of the lone inventor and how really it's the bringing of information learned in one sphere into another sphere and collaborative working that actually produce significant innovations. And, I've thought frequently that blogging is, in many ways, a very simplified form of that exact same process, which is I'm bringing information from my sphere into another one, and you're doing the same, and we are innovating. And that innovation may be thought innovation, but we're still helping to create new ways of thinking about something that then get tested and oftentimes prove to be valuable ways of thinking or doing something.
Well, sure. And I think of what you just described as bridge phenomena, and that's described in some of the social networking literature, where you have some people who serve or act as bridges between one community and another. They transfer the idea through a process of social networking from the one community to the other. In my own work, my background is very varied. I mean, my formal training is in philosophy, of all things. I have experience as a computer programmer, but I also have experience in media, and of course my primary work today is in education, so I'm bridging 4 different communities here. But we want to be careful about how we describe this and how we express this, because this is something that's come up recently. There's the myth of the lone inventor, but the myth of the lone inventor is the myth of a person sitting all by themselves with no communication at all with the outside world, and coming up with light bulbs and phonographs and things like that. And of course that's not the case. But I mean, the opposite to being the lone inventor isn't full-blown collaboration necessarily. You don't go from being a lone inventor to being a member of this team, and all of your individuality is subsumed to the values of this team, and you work under some director or whatever. Some of the things that I've talked about recently, and some of the thoughts that I've had recently, just as a consequence of some of the stuff, have been to try to distinguish between what I've called groups and networks. And the idea here is that you can have a community, but where your ties aren't the strong ties of group identity, but rather the weak ties of a network community. So you maintain your autonomy, you maintain your distinctiveness, and the collaboration or the communication occurs not as a process of belonging to this group, but through a process of open communication and interactivity. So we want to be careful just in how we describe the collaborative aspect of innovation, because I don't think it's as cut and dried as people may think.
Does the homeschool movement bring any understanding or framework for looking at what's happening with your personal learning environments?
Well, that's an interesting question. Homeschooling is much less of a phenomenon here in Canada than in the United States. So, my perception of it is going to be a bit different. I don't see it currently as being a major force. But in the United States, I mean, as much as 1% of students are being homeschooled, which makes it a very large phenomenon. And I do hear from homeschoolers from time to time. I don't know. I mean, because homeschooling is right at the cusp between this desire for independence and diversity and freedom and autonomy, and this desire for control and indoctrination and preservation of the way of life. And you get both of those elements in homeschooling. So, I really see it right at the point of conflict rather than at the point of, discovery or innovation. I might be missing the boat completely on this, but...
Well, our oldest daughter homeschooled, and she homeschooled primarily because she was very much a self-learner, and had interest in great books and in Shakespeare, and was able to pursue an academic course because of her own initiative. And there are a variety of reasons that people homeschool, and that's just one of them. But it does seem that particular reason does kind of fit well with the self-learning aspect of that you've described. And it also, but there is an interesting conflict in that a lot of homeschooling that I've observed has a little bit of an aversion to technology, because they typically tend to be conservative and concerned about what their children are exposed to. So they often miss some of the best aspects of the technology because they're concerned about the influence of it.
Well, yeah, when you homeschool in an effort to avoid or prevent communication with what you consider disruptive influences, you're doing exactly the opposite of what you should be doing, I believe. And I think back at my own education, and even when I was going to school, and of course, that's 6 hours out of every weekday, completely and utterly wasted. I'm exaggerating, of course, but I nonetheless did a lot of what might be called homeschooling. I'd come home from school and I delivered papers, but after I finished with that, I do reading, I do building things, I do all kinds of stuff on my own. Um, we had a good-sized library in the house, and I spent a lot of time on the old Underwood typewriter, typing away and being creative in that way. All of that is homeschooling. It's just that it isn't official homeschooling, and I haven't separated myself from the school system as a whole. And I sort of see homeschooling, maybe a new breed of homeschooling, if you will, being something like the things that people do outside school. And kids today outside school, they don't sit and read paperbacks particularly. They're on their computers and they're coding or playing games or doing whatever. And I see this sort of stuff slowly and gradually permeating the school environment, so that the school becomes an extension of the homeschooling, rather than the homeschooling becoming an extension of the school, the way it was.
I'm often intrigued that people have a variety of perceptions about homeschooling, and having had children both in public school and homeschool, and not being sort of dyed-in-the-wool homeschoolers, but just having used it for purposes that to us at the time seemed valuable. I'm often surprised at people's perceptions of homeschooling. And I will say that I think that all of our experiences with homeschooling have been extremely positive. And most of the homeschooling families that we've associated with have really desired a much greater connection with the public schools. But the public school system is the one that limits their ability to interact. Their kids are, very interested in pursuing a certain path and really studying something, and they'd like to take band or drama or art, from the school.
Right.
But the school says, we can't do that because you're not fully enrolled.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll give my positive plug for homeschooling because I've had such good experiences with it.
No, that's cool. I can certainly understand your perspective in that sense. And again, my biggest worry is, the children who are being homeschooled, who are being brought up in complete isolation from, any sort of communication with the outside world. I certainly worry about what sort of children those will be, and I worry that if the motivation of the homeschooler isn't to expand their children's environments, but rather to contract them, I worry about the sort of damage that's being done to that child's development. So homeschooling is a two-edged sword, and the thing with homeschooling is that the practitioner may or may not be in a good position to make this sort of call. I mean, the homeschooling is like home building. Some people build their own home and it works perfectly. Other people build their own home and it's a fire hazard. And so you need to be careful, and certainly any sort of generalization, homeschooling, blah, 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 is going to be misleading in that sense.
Well, we've certainly had all positive experiences. Let's talk about open source software.
Sure.
What's your view on open source software? How much are you using it? How does it play a role, do you think, in some of the things that we're seeing?
Well, I'm certainly a supporter of open source software. Any software that I write, I like to make available open source. I am constrained to some degree by my employer, which is the Government of Canada, which I am on a daily basis trying to convince to support open software, open source, and open content. I have a number of computer systems. The desktops that I use, I have desktop at home and here at work, are both on Linux systems. I've just installed, in fact, on both of them, the Ubuntu Linux. I was on Mandrake while it was still called Mandrake, so it was really time for me to upgrade, and I decided to go to Ubuntu. It's working pretty well for me. I'm pretty pleased with it. I've laptops which run Windows, so I have a day-to-day comparison, and the reason why I run Windows on the laptops is because they're Dell's, and the Dell laptops, Dell is a sole source provider to the Canadian government, and they use the cheapest wireless cards that they possibly can, which means there's proprietary chipset on the card, which means that there's no open source software that supported them. At least not when I got not when I got the computers. They may be now, I'm not sure, but it's been a couple of years. Open source as a philosophy, I'm very much in support of. I am one of those, though, who won't sacrifice all comforts in order to support that philosophy. I absolutely hate the GIMP, and I cannot use GIMP for an image processing. I find the user interface just to be horrible. And so consequently, if I do any image work, I'll be using PaintShop Pro or even, goodness, Adobe on the laptop. So there is that. I find it very annoying that I can't play my computer games on the Linux system either. So I play video hockey and stuff like that, and I have to play that on the laptop as well. So this gulf between the commercial software systems and Linux is still there, and it still affects me on a day-to-day basis, and consequently I still find I have a need for the commercial system. Although I want to be clear about this is not the fault of the open source system. This is the commercial software companies being greedy and not sharing things. I tried to run a DVD just yesterday, Nico Case, at what was it? The Austin thing. I forget the name of this show. Whatever it's called. And the DVD is one of these new HD DVDs, and of course it wouldn't play on my Windows system, and it certainly wouldn't play on my Linux system. And it's just this sort of thing. And now you have to go out, or at least on my old Windows machine, you have to go out and buy a codec in order to play the DVD that you've just purchased, which I think is ridiculous. And so, this is why I'm in support of open source, is because without open content formats, without the capacity to manage and to rewrite and to control our software, we are very much in the hands of commercial publishers. And when we are in the hands of the commercial publishers, there is always another step where you have to pay for this and pay for that. And it's never ending. It's like extortion, right? You pay the extortioner once, it's not over. There's always more things to buy. And so, over the long run, I want to move as much as I can to open source, recognizing, though, that the commercial software industry is going to keep throwing things at me that make it impossible for me to use open source as much as they can. So, it's sort of two worlds here.
Well, I'm intrigued by something because I think that, part of what's happened over, say, the last 10 or 15 years that I've noticed is that commercial companies of all flavors, whether they're software companies or airlines or whatever it is, cell phone companies, have used lock-in as a device and their primary means for keeping customer revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly right.
One of the things I've really liked about open source, and one of the things I feel is a really positive influence in the commercial world, because the commercial world is, for many of us, how we make a living and needs to exist. One of the things I've really liked is the influence of the open source philosophy in the commercial world. And I think it's because many of these new technologies that are so exciting actually have their roots in open source software. And so those individuals have grown up with a sense of the importance of collaboration, sharing, win-win, and they're bringing that into the marketplace.
I'm not sure I have that sense of optimism that you do. I mean, I look at what's being done on the commercial side almost every day, as much as I look at what's being done on open source, and um, and I see, well, I don't want to call it innovation, but I see something happening in each of the two camps, and I see a commercial software and publishing industry that is relentlessly pursuing this whole lock-in thing. Like, look at the whole Blackboard thing is a good case in point, because now I'm not sure if your listeners will be familiar with the Blackboard lawsuit, but in a nutshell, Blackboard, which is a learning management system company, obtained a patent for, I won't say for the learning management system, but shall we say for essential technologies that make a learning management system possible or resemble what LMSs look like today. Obtained this patent and then immediately turned around and sued a Canadian company called Desire to Learn, which is pretty ridiculous, but we'll leave that aside. And of course, the major concern that was immediately expressed was the impact of this lawsuit on open source, because education as a whole in the world of learning management systems is making the gradual switch over from commercial systems to open source systems, whether that system be Moodle, whether it be Sakai, or whether it be Boddington or eTutor, or any of these others that are becoming an increasingly large source of competition for Blackboard. But now, this story isn't just about Blackboard owning the learning management system technology. And that's why this is important. The open source learning management systems all support, to some degree or another, some sort of content interoperability or content sharing. The holy grail that was intended to be created by learning object metadata and all of that sort of stuff, and learning objects and all of that sort of stuff. It never really did come to pass, but that was always the whole idea. What Blackboard is doing, if you look at what Blackboard is doing through its various partnerships, what it is trying to do is to become the place where students purchase commercial learning materials on their campus. Look at the alignments that Blackboard, what do they call them, strategic alliances and partnerships Blackboard's undertaken with partners like Pearson and other commercial publishing companies. Blackboard wants to position itself to be the primary commercial producer of LMSs. That's why they went after another commercial company. And to be the only place that an educational institution can purchase, or have their students purchase, more accurately, the textbooks and other resources that the professors require that they purchase. In other words, they would shut out not simply open source learning management systems. In fact, they can just ignore the open source learning management systems, because what they will have done is to shut out the free content, the open educational resources. In effect, the only resources available reliably to an educational system are commercial resources. And so their methodology is very much based on lock-in. Just in the same way, the requirement that you have to purchase a codec to play a DVD locks you into some sort of commercial DVD player, and more importantly, locks out free DVD players and indeed even free DVD HD content, because you can't produce the stuff for free if you have to pay for a codec. Same with digital rights management and this whole thing with Content Guard and XRML, now known as, I don't know what it's known as, MPEG REL, ISO REL. They're just marching their way through the standards process, right? If you have to pay for digital rights management technology, then you cannot produce free content and you cannot display free content. So again, at every step of the way here, they're trying to put in some aspect of the technology that makes it impossible to use free content, thereby locking us into commercial content. So you may express optimism, but I see a very determined lock-in based proprietary content and software based strategy being aggressively pursued in our industry.
Well, I think what's interesting to me is that some of the elements of open source which have been so compelling, the collaborative nature of it, the belief in collaboration, the self-learning element, and maybe the grassroots aspects of open source, they seem to be in a position to significantly influence how we interact with each other commercially. And I do see some positive there, and I'm partly intrigued as well because Larry Cuban, whom I interviewed a couple of months back,
right,
sort of gave me the impression that the school system will pretty much chew up anything new that comes along and reshape it into its own image.
That's pretty accurate, yeah.
Well, and what's intriguing to me is watching teachers adopt these technologies, and they're obviously early adopters, but their ability to adopt them because they are, in many instances, free, don't have any cost, and because they are collaborative and to use them, is generating kind of a wave of teacher desire to implement them. And I'm wondering, will that be strong enough to overcome the elements, the negative commercial elements that you're describing?
Short answer is no. And the reason why it's no is because school boards across your country, my country, Australia, New Zealand, and every other place I can think of are blocking these technologies. And they're blocking them because they're not controllable. And because there is this rampant sharing of stuff happening and therefore undesirable influences infiltrating the schools and all of that. And so to a large degree, the only way that they can get to use this kind of technology is if they're doing it in a controlled, which means commercial kind of setting, using commercial applications that have been purchased, therefore ensuring the school board against any liability, because there's always the constant threat that some company might get a patent on things and sue you, even though they say they won't. So there's this control, and it's the commercial proprietary software that gives you control, and open source that actually removes control. And so as long as Control remains the dominant value in the school system, and I see no sign of that changing, and indeed, like Larry says, the school system morphs everything into an image of itself. Yes, because it needs to, keep their hands on it, if you will, to make sure it doesn't run away on them. And so that's what I see the school system certainly attempting to do with this sort of technology, and what I've seen so far. I don't know how else to express it. I wish I could express that a bit more clearly, but do you sort of see the point that I'm getting at here?
Yeah, I do. And what's intriguing to me is that when I was a senior in high school, I really felt like my options were pretty limited. I mean, I didn't feel a lot of independence. Mm-hmm. But I'm noticing that that our children and the children of our friends feel much more independent of the school system than I did. Well, I think part of it is that they are, a lot of their interaction is outside of adult interaction now. They have texting, They have social networking, and so they're already, collaborating independently. And part of it is that I think a lot of their parents are looking at their school situation, and they're maybe giving different advice than our parents did. You can graduate early or go do something independent, in sort of a recognition that traditional schooling is not necessarily the only path to accomplishing something. And I've noticed kids who will, with much more frequency now, choose to graduate early and go off and do something very independent. And I think that's an interesting and kind of exciting thing that's taking place.
Yeah, I think what you'd find is that younger people today, as a whole, are relying on institutions less than they used to, and I think there's two reasons for that. One is the rampant conservatism that has characterized the political environment of their upbringing. So there's more of a stress on being independent, but mainly I think more the capacity to be independent, the capacity to communicate with and do things effectively outside the domains of institutions. It used to be, if you wanted to do things like create a community garden or something like that, you'd have to go to town hall and, maybe get funding or, get some sort of supervisor in place and that. And today they just create a community garden and, they see some vacant land, they create a garden. And, so there isn't the need so much to depend on the support of these institutions, and there's more of a resistance to the control of these institutions. I think school is just one of them. I think you'll find that the democratic process as we know it today, and all that in all capital letters, is another one of these things. I think that young people especially, don't vote not because they're not interested in society, but I think they find that voting to be counterproductive. It just encourages them to keep governing the way they have been governing, and there are better ways to be governed.
Very interesting. Hey, can we take a step back? I'd like to ask you a question about commercialization and the school market.
Sure.
One of the intriguing things to me, and my background in that brings me here to this interview, is that I sold refurbished computer equipment for 20 years, and over the last 5 or 6 years have primarily sold refurbished equipment to schools, and that created an association with schools and technology, and thus my interests. But I'll go to these educational technology shows, and many of them are largely driven by the commercial advertising of programs to schools. And, I keep wondering, is there a better way to be balancing commercial interests and the interests of schooling? Because it does seem that the marketing of anything to schools is a little awkward. It just doesn't seem to fit with my sense of how good decision-making would take place. How do you approach that, and have you seen models that have effectively combined the best of the commercial world with the value set of education?
Well, gee, I was fine until you said that very last thing. Because, like as you were describing that, the thing that struck me, when you're talking about, how awkward it feels to see things marketed to schools, I feel the same sort of way about healthcare and seeing things marketed to doctors. And we get American TV here in Canada, so we see these commercials for healthcare agencies and all of that on our TV, and it's just it seems really weird to be pushing advertising to sick people. I mean, there's I sort of sit there and I think, well, there's something twisted about that. It's kind of like an undertaker going door to door trying to solicit business. So there is an awkwardness to it, and the awkwardness is precisely this. We know that the primary interest of the commercial provider is not the same as our intent in providing the service. There's a conflict of interest there. When we provide something like an educational service, the reason why we do it is because we want kids to learn. When a commercial content or software provider goes and markets to schools, the reason why they do it is to make money. And this conflict happens here. And if these things actually do come into conflict, if there is a situation where the commercial provider has to choose between educating kids or making money, 9 times out of 10 or more, they will choose making money. And and that's why we see the same sort of tension in things like healthcare. And so that's why your last sentence, combining the best of the commercial with all of that, and I'm sort of thinking, well, no, really what I want to do is somehow shelter or insulate public services like the educational services from the bottom line of commercial industry because I don't want to say it's a poison because that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I mean there is this cross purposes, and so that's why I think that it's important that there be some sort of intermediary. I mean, certainly there are going to be commercial providers. There have to be commercial providers for a wide range of reasons. But there needs to be some sort of intermediary between them and the school system so that they are not able to directly affect the manner in which the school system, the educational system is conducted, just as, I would argue, unconvincingly to most Americans, but convincingly to most Canadians, commercial healthcare providers should not be able to come in and influence the manner in which hospitals and doctors' offices and clinics and health insurance is conducted, and for the same reasons. How would I balance these things? I balance them by getting the commercial companies out of selling directly to schools, and I would attempt to ensure that there was a layer of public infrastructure that provided the services and resources that are needed by schools, and that this public infrastructure would do any purchasing needed from commercial entities, but would be acting in the interest of schools and rather than counter to it. How that cashes out is a bit harder, but take, for example, the question of open educational resources. The concept here, and it's being investigated by agencies like OECD and UNICEF and others, is that we consider educational resources, tax simulations, stuff like that, to be an infrastructure, a public good. And so governments and international agencies take on the responsibility of providing this infrastructure. They provide a certain collection, online collection of resources in the same way and in the same manner they currently provide things like fire and police services, or they currently provide things like highways and other transportation infrastructure. They would provide an educational infrastructure in the same way. And this educational infrastructure would be available without charge to anyone in society who needs educating. And then that agency would in turn, where necessary, purchase from the commercial sector whatever goods and services it needs in order to conduct this enterprise. And I see that as, in the longer term, a much more sustainable educational model. Because if commercial providers are providing directly to the educational system, and even more importantly, if they're providing directly to learners, which is what we presume in an era of personal learning, then they will provide only to those with the ability and inclination to pay, which means that if the commercial providers are providing, then we will have a significant section or a significant segment of the population that does not have access to these resources, just as when there are commercial healthcare providers, a significant segment of the population does not have access to healthcare resources. And the social costs of that are too great for society to contemplate. We cannot imagine running a society with that many people unable to access educational resources. In the U.S., 43 million people are without health care. That's the last number I heard. It's probably up now. Can you imagine if you had a country like the United States where 43 million people were not able to access an education? It's inconceivable. And so once you see it from that sort of light, then you see the urgency for this intermediary. You see the urgency for treating educational resources as infrastructure rather than as commodities or commercial products. And that's the position I take.
Interesting. Well, and there's a lot to think about there. I will say that one thing that that's too bad, that I feel some sorrow about, is that however commercial interests have been played out in the last 10 or 20 years, that we have created a perception that commercial companies work primarily based on whether or not they'll make money, and it seems to me that we've lost something, that we've lost the sense that companies can be purpose-driven, and that they are formed as a for-profit company, as a financial structure, but still have a value set that drives their interaction with others.
We can't even get these companies to obey the law. It may be too bad, but structurally they are unable to do anything else. They are unable, even without enforcement, to obey the law. And even with enforcement, they'll still break the law. It's not simply a matter of working in the public interest. They very directly work against the public interest in the quest for these profits. And the structural thing is, once a company goes public, then it has, by definition, indeed almost by law, no objective other than to increase shareholder value. That's what going public means. And you see company after company, they go public, they become evil. Just like Google went public, became evil. Or you see, they get purchased. Flickr, right? Purchased by Yahoo, went evil. There's a structural problem to be dealt with there. And until that structural problem is dealt with, you can't trust corporations with the public good.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got some short amount of time to keep within my commitment to an hour-long interview, but let me pepper you with a couple of quick questions.
Go ahead.
So, how has Flickr become evil? Is it the metadata issue?
It's the metadata issue. It's the Flickr API. There's some other things I'd have to actually look up before I can just give you the quick answer off the top of my head. You're saying you're peppering me with quick questions. So I'm trying to answer quickly.
Understood.
Yeah.
Okay, so I recently created a customized search engine for bloggers that support blogging, and you were quick to give me some direct feedback that took it in a direction different than I was going. And your concern was to make sure that as many people were included in that definition of educational bloggers as possible. Is that an accurate way of describing what you were feeling? Can you sort of clarify? Because I think you do have a concern there about making sure that there is a broad vision.
Well, the list of people that you selected were a small, and I would argue unrepresentative sample of the blogosphere, the edu-blogosphere as a whole, and consequently, left out many points of view. Left out, the selection that you had would have been predominantly K-12 and predominantly U.S. based, and the edu-blogosphere is much more than U.S. K-12 education, much more than that. And so I felt that there needed to be a wider inclusion of people who are working in this field. And the ratio is that 300 to 100 ratio. It's like, you pick 100 from a certain segment, there's 200 other people out there in a different segment.
Well, and I think that perspective was really valuable to me. It wasn't my intention to exclude.
No.
All I was doing was saying, people who've placed their blogs on this wiki, here's a way you can search those blogs. But I think it happened at the same time that you were discussing this issue of the K-12 online conference. Yeah,
and you happened to pick just that same group of people.
Well, and it was because they had been placed on the wiki,
Right.
It was for lack of my having a broader list to actually draw from.
Right.
But I think the point was well taken, and I think that's that question is the one that interests me, not my motivation or lack of performing well, but more the question of what is the risk that only certain voices get heard or become the predominant voices, and clearly you have a desire to help make sure that those voices are varied and diverse.
right. And I'm always very sensitive about that. On my own website and in my own reading, I do try as much as I can to get as diverse a selection as I can. And I'm also, there's also the flip side, right? Because, as I get more diverse voices, more people come to depend on my newsletter, my blog, for their source, which is a centralization I'd really rather try to avoid. So consequently, I try as well very hard to get people to leave my blog, my website, and actually go and visit to these people, to their websites, and talk to them directly. The centralization, those sorts of issues apply to me as well. And, I shouldn't be central.
So how do you balance the need for diversity, different voices, lack of centralization, with just the base issue of time? I mean, you're obviously looking at an enormous amount of material. How do you handle the huge amount of material available to us now without becoming so selective that you miss, that you focus only on certain voices? Or is that just inevitable?
Well, there are 5-6 billion people in the world. I'm going to focus on certain voices. And predominantly I focus on the ones that are English. That brings it down a bit because I can't read other languages. Once we get good translators, I'm going to be faced with a big problem. And I'm limited to the ones I know about. And even I have a list of sites in my aggregator. I have to be careful not to start at the top every day, because if I start at the top, they're listed in alphabetical order, and I'll be favoring those that have numbers or A's or B's or C's as their blog name rather than R or K or Y. So I have to pick different places in my list to start every day in case I don't get to finish the whole list. I read very quickly. I read analytically. I have a very strong background in logic, which means that I can very quickly comprehend what somebody has written and be able to represent that very quickly. So it does not, in fact, take me as much time as you might imagine to cover a wide array of sources. And also, too, I'm directed by the sort of thing that I'm looking for. If you look at my blog, you see an About a Well Daily, and I list very specifically the sorts of things that I want to cover, the sorts of issues, and open source is one of them. Open content is another one. Networks is another one. And I have a bunch of these themes that I go after, and so I can very quickly scan content and determine whether or not it's on the topic that I'm interested in. And so I don't need to read the whole thing necessarily. If somebody's writing about, my dog ate, T-bone yesterday. I know reading the headline that's probably not what I need. I'll read the headlines, quickly skim the item, and just in case, because people don't always title their items accurately. So I can get through a very large volume of content in a hurry.
How much time each day are you spending reading blog postings and writing?
The answer to that is I don't stop, but the other answer to that is 2 hours. And I know that sounds contradictory, because I'm a researcher. My job is to read stuff and to write. And so I count the time that I spend specifically writing articles in the newsletter as the time that I spend doing that. And I spend about 2 hours searching for and writing articles in the newsletter. And the rest of my time is spent as a researcher. But, there's so much overlap here.
It is interesting to me. One of the things I do really like about blogging is that it's sort of the resurgence of reading. Mm-hmm. I know that when I was in high school, I had a summer job, and my employer encouraged me during lunch hour to always bring a book and read a book during that hour.
That's a good idea.
And it was. And then my daughter brought home, I have a daughter who's in junior high school, and she brought home a book about a week ago, and I thought, I've never heard of this book, and I read it and read through to the end and asked her which teacher had recommended it, and I sent an email to the teacher and let her know my thoughts in response to the book. And the teacher wrote me back and she said, I'm just glad to know that there are still adults out there reading novels. And I thought, well, I really like reading, and one of the things I like about these new technologies is that they do provide a lot of opportunity for reading, for thinking, and then for learning to construct thoughts into words in order to reply.
Yeah, I read constantly, and I do read books from time to time, on airplanes especially. But most of my reading these days is online. But you're quite right. It used to be my habit of reading was expensive, and now it's free, and that's what the internet gave us.
Fascinating. Stephen, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm really appreciative of your making time to do this.
Oh, not at all. It's my pleasure.